It's not my Maryland. It's not your Maryland. It's our Maryland. Welcome to Maryland, our Maryland. My name is Miserendino, and I'm excited to be alongside Dr. Anirban Basu, a CEO of Sage Policy Group. Welcome to another episode where today we plan to talk a lot about the history behind the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Let's zoom into Maryland now in 1814. All right, so the country is at war. We don't like it when our trade is disrupted. We don't like it when people are forced to be part of the British Navy. The War of 1812 is still going on in 1814. And the British have decided that they need to go to Washington, maybe even burn it down. And so they're coming through Maryland, and actually there's a battle at Bladensburg in Prince George's County that does not go well for the Americans. In August of 1814, the British kind of dust aside some of the Americans interfering with them at Bladensburg. So they've got an open road to Washington, D.C. now. And they go in and they burn the place down. And they don't just burn miscellaneous buildings. They burn a lot of government buildings. They burn the U.S. Capitol. They burn the White House. President Madison ends up on the run. He hangs out in different places. There was one night when Madison was on the run that he spent the night in Brookville, Maryland, which is just north of Olney down there in Montgomery County. So if you talk to old-timey Brookvillians, they'll say that Brookville was the capital of the USA for one night back in August of 1814. So, all right, Maryland is starting to get involved here. The British have come through Maryland. Apparently, they didn't have much trouble getting to D.C. to burn it down. It's going to be pretty hard to march so many miles from the bay, basically, to D.C. and burn it down, but they did it. And the blaze was so big that many parts of Maryland could see a glowing sky that night, and not just Montgomery County and Prince George's County. In Baltimore City, they could see that the sky was glowing like fire down in D.C. So that had to be concerning. That had to be pretty alarming for people in Baltimore. Because in Baltimore, they knew that Baltimore would be a pretty good prize for the British as well. The demographics of Maryland in those days were pretty different than today. Try to picture this version of the state of Maryland. In the 1810 census, that's the last census before the war began, Maryland's population was 380,546. You just said that there were over 400,000 employed people in Baltimore County. Well, that's more than the number of people who lived in all Maryland at that time. All right, we have many counties today that have blown past twice the population of the entire state of Maryland in 1810. And like the country, the state was pretty rural. Baltimore City had over 46,000 residents. That's not a very high percentage of 380,000. But Baltimore, with 46,000 some residents, was the third largest city in the country. It was a very rural country. Even New York City, which had about 96,000 residents, well, about 90% of New Yorkers did not live in New York City. It was a very rural country. Cities like New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore that were the biggest all had 96, 53, 46,000 people, numbers like that. Right? Not, in some cases, not even enough to fill a football stadium today. At 46,000 people, Baltimore was way bigger than Washington, which had just been burned down. In those days, Washington and Georgetown were actually separate jurisdictions in the District of Columbia. And Washington and Georgetown together had about 14,000 people. So Baltimore was way bigger. And Baltimore knows that it's a port city, it's larger, it's not far from Washington. Washington's already been burned down. People realize that Baltimore could be next. And that mobilizes vast numbers of locals, Baltimoreans and Marylanders, to try and erect defenses around the city. Defenses that were far more than just Fort McHenry itself. All right, so Maryland has about 380,000 people. That's not a lot of people when you think about social networks. If you're a somewhat prominent person, there are very few, if any, degrees of separation between you and other notable people, important people. And that comes into play here. I'm always fascinated whenever I read about the early decades of the USA, about how many people just knew each other. When you come across key figures, there's a good chance they knew a lot of other really important figures. They could get to them. So let's talk about some of the individual Marylanders now, that they're worried about what these British troops are going to do after burning Washington, D.C. So after burning D.C., lots of British troops, they're headed back to the fleet in the Bay. and they go through Prince George's County, Upper Marlboro. So here now we're getting to some really specific circumstances that are going to lead to Key ending up in your former candidate. When the British went through Upper Marlboro, nobody was particularly hostile towards them. I mean, what are you going to do? You have all these troops coming through, you just let them go. But some of the British stragglers, maybe deserters, they started making trouble on some local homesteads. They were hungry. They might rummage through your chicken coop and steal an animal. And there was a doctor. He was a Prince George's County native who was living in Upper Marlboro. His name was Dr. William Beans. And Dr. Beans had been very kind to many British soldiers. He himself was about 65 years old. So he's this elderly doctor. So he's a person of some prominence. He's a doctor. How many doctors could there even been in Maryland at that time? And he had helped many British soldiers who were casualties. But when he saw some British soldiers misbehaving, mistreating property, rummaging through the chicken coops, he is involved in rounding up some of these soldiers and making sure they're arrested. Because it's one thing to just march through Upper Marlboro, but you can't come in here and mess with people's chickens. One of the fellows who he was involved in locking up got away, told the British authorities at the fleet that this Dr. Beans was causing trouble. And so British authorities came into Upper Marlboro and very hastily arrested Dr. Beans. Well, Dr. Beans, he lives in Maryland, 1814. A lot of people know who he is. Right? He's a notable guy. Some years earlier, Dr. Beans was a founding member of what became the Maryland State Medical Society. That's still around today. That's a licensing organization that is still functioning. And Dr. Beans was one of its founders way back in 1799. So now in 1814, he's arrested. All right, older guy. I don't even know if I've read that he barely had time to pick up his glasses. I mean, they got him and said, "You're coming with us. You're going to the ship." And the British weren't messing around. I mean, they intended to take him far from here, maybe up to Halifax. So around southern Maryland, even though they didn't have phones, word spread pretty quickly that, oh my gosh, they got old man Beans. The good doctor's been arrested. Somebody needs to do something. And one of Dr. Beans' acquaintances was a Georgetown lawyer, a young Georgetown lawyer, who's actually a Marylander through and through. That's Francis Scott Key. And Francis Scott Key is very much a Marylander, even though he's a Georgetown lawyer. He was born in a pretty area. It was Frederick County at the time, but it's actually Carroll County today. The Tawnytown, Thurmont, Emmitsburg triangle?
Oh, sure. Mount St. Mary's.
South of Mount St. Mary's, between Thurmont. It's the seldom researched triangle. Tawnytown, Thurmont, and Emmitsburg. Well, Key was born up that way. South of Emmitsburg, between Tawnytown and Thurmont. His family's very wealthy. His family has a lot of political connections. On his wife's side, there are lots of connections. And I think we should mention, we're going to talk about it a little more too, there are connections to the institution of slavery as well. Key himself had what many historians like to call a complicated relationship with the institution, did many things that today we would look at and say, wow, that was really good that he did that for people who were enslaved. And did many things that we would look at and say, oh, I can't believe he did that. And both sides of his family were steeped in it. One of his wife's brothers, one of his brothers-in-law, owned a plantation in Talbot County where the great Maryland abolitionist Frederick Douglass lived as a child. So you've got this notion again that so many people know each other. People know each other. If you're in the Key family, you know a lot of prominent Marylanders. You know Dr. Beans. Dr. Beans knows a lot of prominent Marylanders. Word gets around that old man Beans is in trouble. And so Francis Scott Key wants to help. Francis Scott Key, by the way, is another person with a connection to Maryland institutions. He was a founder of the St. John's and Annapolis College Alumni Association. He actually helped found the Alumni Association there at St. John's, where he studied himself for many years. He graduated when he was 17, but he started schooling there at 10. So the whole college system was a little different in those days. Well, Key, again, lots of people know each other. Key wants to help out Dr. Beans, but he's a lawyer. He's a prominent guy. He's not going to just go on his own to try and track down the British fleet in a canoe and help his buddy out. He goes to get permission from President Madison. Right? So you could do that in those days. I mean, oh my gosh, old man Beans is hurt. Who's going to give us permission to go rescue him? How about I just go ask the president for authorization? So he went to meet the president in Washington. They did not meet at the White House on account of the White House had been burned down. But Madison said, hey, sounds like a great idea. Go get old man Beans. I don't like the idea of the British arresting a civilian in this war. Go help Dr. Beans out. And Madison would have been well acquainted with all sorts of key Marylanders at that time. He was the kind of lawyer. He was not, it wasn't exactly like Better Call Francis Scott Key. He was the kind of lawyer who would argue in front of the Supreme Court. Even in his 20s, did you ever see Hamilton?
Yes.
Well, I give you some more reason to perhaps think, I mean, we don't need to speak ill of the dead, but if you wanted to judge Aaron Burr, if you were a judgmental guy, I'd say Aaron Burr did more than just kill Hamilton. Or there's a Francis Scott Key connection here. After the United States acquired the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon and the French, when Jefferson was president, Burr, and this is after he shot Hamilton, Burr went out west and allegedly conspired to break part of the territory away from the country and start his own, we don't know what, a kingdom where he would be king, an empire where he would be emperor. He was a schemer. And Burr and many associates got busted on treason. Francis Scott Key defended some of Burr's associates in the treason case. And it was a successful defense. So Key helped get them off. So it's not like a random ambulance chaser ended up on this ship to get Dr. Beans. Key is a notable lawyer. He meets with no less than the president. He gets permission to go on a diplomatic mission under a truce ship to go chase the fleet. And as it turns out, they're headed towards Baltimore. And Key gets a wingman who's another Marylander. All right, so Dr. Beans is a Prince George's County guy. Key goes back to Frederick County. He has a lot of connections to Frederick. That's why we even have the Frederick Keys today. Well, this wingman, if you will, who's going to help Key negotiate a release of Dr. Beans is a Calvert County native named John Stuart Skinner. He's only in his 20s at this time, but he's another interesting guy. Some of these guys had their hand in so many different things. Skinner, soon after the war, was a pioneer in American agricultural journalism. When you hear it, it'll sound like the most obvious thing. I mean, it's the kind of thing the consultants do today. It's the kind of thing we teach college courses on. It's the kind of thing you use YouTube for today. But this guy Skinner, who's going to be Francis Scott Key's wingman here, this guy Skinner created a journal called The American Farmer because he said, and he said it to people like Thomas Jefferson. Again, so many people know each other. He said, wouldn't it be nice if all these farmers in this rural country could read basically a newspaper and they could use it like a go-to guide for farming? You find out what different people, maybe even notable people like Thomas Jefferson, did in terms of climate or scientific testing or livestock growing practices. We should have a paper where you can read about best practices or successes. Right? So I'll make you a farmer for a moment, Anirban. Is that all right?
Yeah, let's do this.
You want to be a farmer?
Yeah.
For marketing purposes, I was thinking this morning about Beets by Basu.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That makes sense.
I mean, no beet salad is complete without the rich flavor of Beets by Basu bursting with intense beet flavor.
Yes.
A lot of people are going to wonder, man, how's this guy get his beets to taste so darn good? And maybe you've done something interesting. I don't know, maybe it has to do with the basics of climate or irrigation practice. Maybe you did something weird. I don't know. Maybe you put loudspeakers around your acres of beet farms and started blasting 80s movie soundtracks over it.
But not in 1812, but go ahead.
No, and then. But whatever it is that you did, you might put an article in the American Farmer and subscribers, it was subscription-based, could read about it and they could make submissions. So that turned out to be a very important thing in the early 19th century. Doesn't seem really adjacent to negotiating for the release of prisoners, but so many of these guys wore a lot of hats. This fellow Skinner was also a postmaster in Baltimore for a while, but here he is before the American Farmer, before being a postmaster. He is a wingman with Francis Scott Key. By the way, whenever Thomas Jefferson and agriculture comes up, I think of another line from the Broadway musical Hamilton. Remember when Hamilton says to Jefferson, keep ranting, we know who's really doing the planting? Yeah, it's a very important thing to remember when we talk about agriculture at this time. Well, as Key and Skinner are going to the British fleet to try and rescue Beans from who knows what fate it could be, he might even be killed at some point, who knows. Marylanders throughout the area are preparing defenses at Baltimore. And it was everybody working together. I mean, there are all kinds of accounts of enslavers and the enslaved, free African Americans and immigrants all working together to dig trenches and build defenses throughout the area because they figured that Baltimore would be next. And these defenses were all over the city. It wasn't just at the fort that already existed, Fort McHenry. There were places kind of in eastern Baltimore City by where Patterson Park is today, and it was all hands on deck. In Baltimore City at that time, there were actually more free African Americans than enslaved African Americans. That's going to be an important theme for Baltimore history throughout the 1800s. Well, when Skinner and Key get to the ship, they get to the fleet, they successfully negotiate the release of Beans because they were smart enough to bring some useful evidence. They had some letters from British troops who testified to the fact that Dr. Beans had given them good treatment when they were casualties. So he may have arranged for the arrest of deserters who were messing with Prince George's County families, but he had treated a number of other British soldiers well. And so Major General Robert Ross said, okay, I guess we shouldn't leave this guy Beans here. You three can leave, but here's the problem. If Key, Skinner, and Beans leave, they're going to spill the beans on any attack plans that they have. They've seen the fleet. They've seen the cannons. They've seen supplies. They've heard tell of some of the British plans. So the British tell the three that they have to stay on an American truce ship. And that's the ship where Key is going to watch it all go down. But the invasion of Baltimore doesn't begin with the bombing of Fort McHenry. There's actually a land invasion in southeastern Baltimore County at North Point, and Major General Robert Ross himself is there. This Robert Ross was a veteran of wars all over the world. Right? He is an accomplished British military leader. He's been in Egypt during the Napoleonic Wars. He's been throughout Europe. But he didn't make it out of Dundalk. He got shot, probably by a Maryland teenager. We're not sure which guy shot him, but we think it was a teenager, a sharpshooter. And the Maryland militia, so this is lots of Marylanders. Again, it's a Maryland project. A lot of people know each other. The Maryland militia kind of slows up the invasion long enough to buy some time to make the defenses stronger. And it probably bought them some time that they killed the British general. The guy got shot on land, and they didn't want to bury him here locally, so they decided, Anirban, to get his naked body into a barrel of Jamaican rum. That's how they preserved his body to take it home. I don't know what you'd want to be dipped in that situation.
Jamaican rum would be perfect. Honey, Jamaican rum, baby oil. Anyway, but go ahead. Keep going.
So it's only after some time was bought and after the land invasion had already begun that the actual bombing of Fort McHenry, that's when the more famous part of the story begins. The British fleet tries to bomb the fort. They feel like they can't complete an invasion of the city unless they take over the fort or destroy the fort in some way. I mean, think of the geography of the area today. You can't get by there with ships to get towards the inner harbor without being within range of weapons on that fort. Now, the battle itself at Fort McHenry was not bloody by the standards of, say, a Civil War battle, but there were several casualties, and there were 5 people who died, and there's one I'd like to spotlight. He's another Marylander, right? And there was some help from some other states here, but this is a lot of Marylanders, a lot of locals fighting to defend Baltimore, Maryland, the whole country. One of the casualties at Fort McHenry was William Williams, who was out of Prince George's County. He had been enslaved, but he ran away. And he took a job in the U.S. Army, in U.S. infantry, which was technically illegal. He was technically breaking the law as an enslaved person joining the infantry, but he managed to get in, and I'd be really curious to know what he really thought, what all of his motives were. But he took this job defending the country that denied him very basic human and citizenship rights. And he is one of the 5 people killed. A cannonball blew off his leg, and a few months later he died. And he was only about 21 years old. William Williams was the name he went by. He had a different name when he was enslaved. William Williams is a Marylander making this a Maryland story, a Maryland project. So when that defense succeeds, after lots of bombing, It's the next morning that Francis Scott Key gives its immortality by writing the poem. He sees the next morning that the forts are bombed. He sees the massive flag, the Star Spangled Banner flying. He writes this poem, The Defense of Fort McHenry, that very quickly gets put to music and becomes an important patriotic song. It was used like a national anthem even before it officially became a national anthem in 1931. And so that famous part of the story, the anthem itself, I think this is my thesis here as I think about it. It's not just a moment in Baltimore and U.S. history. It is very much a Maryland project brought about by the actions of many Marylanders through many locations throughout our state. And so that's the kind of thing a history nerd might think about when crossing a bridge, named the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And the bridge, of course, was located, and the new one will be located very close to where this all happened. Sometimes they put a buoy out there with stars and stripes on it, and that buoy is the approximate location where we think Francis Scott Key was as he watched all of this unfold. There was a consortium of civil rights groups a couple years ago that thought that perhaps the name of the new bridge should not be Francis Scott Key. They were concerned about Key's relationship with slavery. It doesn't seem like that's gained any traction. But it is true, and this word complicated, Anirban, it's a big history professor word. This relationship that Key had with slavery is actually pretty complicated. He did own slaves himself, but on many occasions, pro bono, he defended enslaved people in suits seeking freedom. But then on other occasions, he took pay to do the opposite, take suits that would keep people enslaved. There were times when he was seen as an enemy of the abolitionist movement, and yet there was another time when a very important abolitionist newspaper called him a friend of men of color, when he basically showed up to ride on horseback with a very large number of free blacks at the funeral for a very prominent free black in Washington, D.C. There's a lot more to it too, but suffice to say, it is pretty complicated. There were lots of things that he did that we would see as antithetical to freedom, antithetical to the values that we even might think about when we listen to the Star Spangled Banner, and then other things we might read that we would see as more in line with it. But it does appear, at least for now, like the new Key Bridge, by everything you're talking about, is going to be named the Key Bridge again. Maybe there's a little more for us to think about when we eventually do get to ride over it again.
Look, that was phenomenal. I mean, I have chills listening to all that. And that's what this podcast is about. And I'm saying this to the listeners, of course, which is it's about Maryland. It's the greatest state in the country. We're the luckiest people on the planet. And we're going to talk about Maryland shamelessly. And, this history, and yes, a history for better or for worse. And, our contemporary society for better or for worse. But it's an amazing place in which we live. And part of, being a Marylander is being amidst all that history. Whether in Frederick County or Prince George's County or in Baltimore County.
So many counties involved in this story.
Exactly. As you said, it's a Maryland project. You said that several times. That's exactly what it is. But that Maryland history is U.S. history and therefore global history, right? That battle changed the course of human affairs. I can imagine if the British prevail in Baltimore, then they're off to the races.
It would have been a problem. One of the quirks of the War of 1812 is that the last great battle in the war was fought after the war was already over.
New Orleans.
That's right. There had already been a treaty signed at Ghent in Belgium, but word traveled slowly from Belgium to Louisiana, and the battle at New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson roughed up the British pretty good, that battle technically happened after the treaty ending the war had already been signed. And so with that victory in New Orleans, which was in early 1815, it wasn't that long after Fort McHenry, and I would argue even with Fort McHenry, a lot of Americans felt like winners in this war, even though on paper it was basically just a ceasefire. A lot of the things that caused the war were no longer a factor. A lot of Americans felt like winners after the war, and we saw a period of very high nationalism in many respects in the decades after the War of 1812. And of course, the song, The Star Spangled Banner, became very popular in a time when patriotic songs were very popular, and it was used for a long time in patriotic settings before it officially became the national anthem. In 1931, Herbert Hoover was president when that happened, and many Baltimore and Maryland politicians were very excited that this part of our local history became cemented as an official part of U.S. history and U.S. patriotism in the eyes of regular folks who might sing the anthem on a regular day.
Interesting. Yeah, because, of course, the Great Depression is happening at that time, right? It's right in 1929 to 1933. Right in the middle is 1931.
Yeah,
So
Hoover's
we
not
celebrate.
doing much, but he
No.
did that.
No, Hoover's not popular at that time. But like I say, it's fascinating history. And now we're, of course, going to be talking about, for years to come, as it turns out, the rebuilding of the Francis Scott Key Bridge and the economics of that and the politics of that. But it's very interesting that you pointed out something very real and very important. Key's legacy is complicated and shaped by his time.
In Maryland, slavery was legal. There's a lot to be said, perhaps in the future, about how Marylanders felt about the Civil War. Maryland's relationship with slavery, I'd say, had some complicated nature to it. Many prominent families were landowning and wealthy, and therefore they were enslavers. But also you had a very large population of free blacks. And by the time we get to the Civil War, Baltimore is home to more free African Americans than any other city. And even in the 1810s, all the different sources say by that time already there were more free blacks than enslaved blacks at that time. So throughout our society, there are lots of different views held by Marylanders, and that's part of the reason why Maryland is going to end up being a border state when it comes to the Civil War.
We are.
On another occasion.
We'll definitely do a podcast on Maryland's role in the Civil War, of course, but we're going to explore a lot of our state's history, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, and of course, the contemporary century. And so I look forward to it. That was breathtaking, what you just went through. That history was very, very, very interesting.
Well, you're too kind. Do we have an official farewell yet?
We don't, but I'd like to wish our audience farewell.
All right. Very good. Well, until next time then, my name's Louis Miserendino, and for Dr. Anirban Basu, this is Maryland, Our Maryland.
Maryland, Our Maryland is produced in partnership with Suited. For podcast production, digital strategy, and creative support, visit looksuited.com.